Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are getting into one of the most ambitious and, most debated ideas of our time, the Green New Deal. We're going to break down what it is, the huge economic problems it's trying to solve, and the really deep ethical questions that it forces all of us to face. So let's kick things off with a really foundational concept in economics, and it's captured perfectly in this famous line from Al Harberger. It's this idea of pure efficiency. That when you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, a dollar is a dollar, its value is constant, doesn't matter who gets it or how you spend it. It's a simple, powerful, and very tidy way to see the world. It lets policymakers make choices based on some pretty straightforward math. But, as you can imagine, climate change just throws a massive wrench into that whole tidy logic. It forces us to ask a much messier, much more complicated question. How do we value the well-being of future generations, our kids, our grandkids, people who aren't even born yet, against the very real, very immediate costs we face today? And that right there isn't just an economic calculation, it's an ethical one. Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dig into how climate change is already making inequality worse. Then we'll get a clear definition of the Green New Deal and look at a real-world proposal. After that, we'll wrestle with that core ethical dilemma, valuing the future, and we'll examine the disconnect between who's polluting and who's paying the price. And finally, we'll pull it all together to see what a path forward might look like. All right, first things first. It is so important to understand that climate change isn't some distant, abstract environmental problem. No, it's happening right now, and it's acting as a powerful engine for economic inequality, hitting the world's most vulnerable people the hardest. And the data on this? It is incredibly clear. Now, what's really striking when you look at this table is just how consistent all these different studies are. You've got Dell and his colleagues finding that for every single degree of warming, poor countries see their economic growth slow down by 1.3%. You've got the IPCC projecting up to a 2% hit on annual output. The message is exactly the same across the board. Rising temperatures are a major drag on the economy. And we're not just talking about damage from storms and floods. This is about lower crop yields, worse labor productivity in the heat, a hit to overall economic stability. And this number, this one really drives home the scale of what we're talking about. A projection from one 2018 study is it's stark. If we stay on a high emissions path, the GDP of low-income countries could be slashed by a staggering 9% by 2100. Let's put that in perspective. That isn't like a temporary recession. That is a permanent economic handicap. It's like erasing almost a tenth of a nation's wealth, and it's a wound largely inflicted by the actions of other countries. So here's the real kicker. This link isn't just theoretical. The research confirms it. The more vulnerable a country is to climate change, the worse its own internal income inequality gets. The poorest people, right? They're often farmers, they have the fewest resources to deal with a flood or a drought, they lose the most. And this creates a horrible, vicious cycle. A climate disaster widens the gap between the rich and poor, which then leaves the most vulnerable even less prepared for the next disaster. So, if climate-driven inequality is the diagnosis, what's the proposed treatment? Well, that brings us to the Green New Deal, which is an idea that has gone from the political fringe to the absolute center of global debate, and it's happened really, really fast. At its core, you have to think of the Green New Deal as a framework, not just one single law. It makes this really bold argument that you cannot solve the climate crisis without also solving economic inequality. The whole idea is to use massive public investment to switch away from fossil fuels, but, and this is the key part, to do it in a way that creates millions of good-paying jobs, rebuilds our infrastructure, and makes sure the benefits are shared by everybody, especially those communities that have been historically left behind. And that name, of course, is no accident. It's a very deliberate callback to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which used huge public works projects to pull the U.S. out of the Great Depression. The idea itself has actually been around since the mid-2000s, but it was really reborn around 2018. It was fueled by increasingly urgent science reports and a string of devastating hurricanes, wildfires, and heat waves that suddenly made the climate crisis feel incredibly immediate and just undeniable. Okay, so let's get out of the clouds of the big concept and get down to a specific, really high-profile example, just so we can see what these policies actually look like on paper. We're going to look at the resolution that really pushed the GND into the mainstream political conversation in the United States. The 2019 resolution from Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey, it laid out a 10-year plan for a national mobilization. And as you can see, the scope is huge. It's not just about solar panels and wind turbines. It weaves the energy transition directly into social and economic justice. Now you might be looking at this and wondering, wait, universal healthcare? What's that got to do with it? Well, the logic is that a just transition needs a strong social safety net. You can't ask people to go through a massive economic change if they're terrified about getting sick or losing their home. It's all part of the same vision. A resilient environment needs a resilient population. Now, while the resolution itself wasn't a law and it didn't pass, it was a political lightning rod. It brought together this huge coalition. One letter to Congress was signed by over 600 different organizations. And what's interesting is it wasn't just the usual environmental groups, it was labor unions, social justice advocates, faith groups. This broad support really signaled a fundamental shift. The fight over climate was no longer just about preserving nature, it was about building a more just and equitable economy. So this massive scale brings us right back to that deep philosophical question we started with. How in the world do you justify spending trillions of dollars today for benefits that might not be fully felt for 50 or even 100 years? And to get that, we have to talk about a concept in economics called discounting. In economics, pure time discounting is basically the idea that a good thing happening in the future is worth less than that same good thing happening today, just because it's in the future. It's a formal way of embedding our impatience into policy. And I mean, think about what that really means. It's an official policy position that says a human life saved 100 years from now is just worth less than a life saved today. Now, it's really important to separate this from something else called discounting for risk. It is totally logical to say a future benefit isn't 100% guaranteed, right? There is a tiny, tiny chance humanity gets wiped out by a meteor. That's a probability calculation. But pure time discounting isn't about risk, it is a pure ethical judgment. It's not a calculation, it's a value statement. And that statement is our well-being matters more simply because we exist right now. As you can imagine, a lot of philosophers and ethicists have a real problem with that. What's wild is that this is not a new debate at all. The philosopher David Hume was writing about this exact human tendency almost 300 years ago. He called it a narrowness of soul, this natural hardwired instinct we have to choose immediate gratification over long-term well-being. He saw it as a fundamental part of our nature, something we can't just wish away. And this is the brilliant leap that Hume made. He argued that this short-sightedness is precisely why we create governments and laws in the first place. We build institutions to act as a check on our own impatience. We empower leaders to make long-term justice their immediate job, We basically pay them to think about the future so the rest of us don't have to. For Hume, that's the whole point of government, to overcome our collective short-sightedness and make the wise long-term choice for everybody. So this whole ethical debate about our responsibility to the future, it becomes razor sharp, painfully clear, when you look at the reality of our responsibility right now, in the present. The data reveals this profound injustice about who is causing climate change versus who is paying the steepest price. Just look at this chart. The story it tells about emissions per person is stark. The average citizen in a wealthy nation like the US, Canada, or Australia has a carbon footprint more than 10 times larger than someone in India. And that's not just some abstract number. It represents a massive gap in how we consume energy and resources to fuel our lifestyles. And this chart paints an even more dramatic historical picture. If you look at all the carbon that has been pumped into the atmosphere over time, the world's richest 10% are responsible for about half of it. Half. Meanwhile, the entire bottom 50% of the world's population is responsible for just 12%. This is the very definition of an unfair footprint. The benefits of all that fossil-fueled growth have flowed to a small group, while the consequences, they're being felt by everyone, and especially by the poor. So, we have this massive economic problem that's driving inequality. We have a deep ethical problem of injustice, both between countries and between generations. So, where do we possibly go from here? Well, the sources seem to point toward a framework that tries to integrate all these challenges. Let's just break this down. So, step one, we have to see climate change for what it is, a colossal market failure. Put simply, the price we pay for fossil fuels doesn't include the enormous cost of the damage they cause. Step two, frame the response not just as a sacrifice, but as a chance for a new industrial revolution, one that brings these huge side benefits like cleaner air, better health, and restored ecosystems. And finally, step three, and this is maybe the most important, make sure the transition is fair. That means the costs aren't dumped on the poor and that opportunities like new jobs for fossil fuel workers and investment in frontline communities are baked into the plan from the very beginning. So, when it all comes down to it, this whole debate is about so much more than just technology or economics. The Green New Deal, in all its different forms, it's forcing a conversation about our deepest values. It's asking us to decide not just how we're going to build a sustainable world, but who that world is for. So the ultimate challenge here isn't just technical. It's a question of intergenerational justice. And really, it's a question that all of us have to answer.